Welcome to Absolutely Don't Do This, the worst podcast ever, and how to avoid making yours hit. It's a no good, very bad, awful, absolute abomination of a podcast. I'm Chris Jolly, and I'm here with my co-host, Tilly Storm.
Hey everyone, so Chris and I have decided to make the worst podcast ever, and we're not joking. We're going to do everything wrong so you don't have to.
That's right, Tilly. We're talking terrible audio quality, super boring topics, and absolutely no editing. Yeah, you'll get to experience everything that makes a podcast totally unlistenable.
And just to add some spice to the mix, we've got a few tricks up our sleeves to make things even worse. So strap in, chicos, it's going to be a bumpy ride.
Now, I know what you're thinking. Why would anybody want to listen to a podcast that's intentionally terrible? But just hear me out. By listening to our show, you'll learn exactly everything not to do when creating your own podcast. Think of it as a cautionary tale.
We're like the ghost of bad podcasts, past, present, and future, all rolled into one. And by the end of our run, you will be a podcasting expert.
Or not. And if you're already an experienced podcaster, don't worry. We've got plenty of new mistakes you've probably never even thought to make before.
We're going to take bad podcasting to a whole new level. We're like the pioneers of terrible podcast content.
Okay, Tilly, so what are we going to cover in some of the upcoming episodes?
Well, Chris, we'll be discussing things like how to choose the most uninteresting guest for your podcast. We'll also teach you how to interrupt your co-host constantly, and how to forget your own talking.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Then there's our episode on the best places to record your podcast, like a fan favorite, the busy coffee shop, or an active construction site. It'll be a complete nightmare for our listeners, but hey, we're all about giving them that bad experience.
Oh, and we can't forget about our segment on how to use annoying sound effects to make your listeners want to rip their freaking hair out. We've got some real gems in store for you folks.
There's also one of my favorites, the episode on how to make terrible jokes and puns as a purveyor of fine dad jokes. I'm really great at these. Trust us, I'll have you cringing in embarrassment.
And if we're feeling really daring, we might even do a live episode where we have absolutely no script or no plan.
Wait,
it'll be the ultimate disaster.
There's a script? I didn't get a script. Anyway, the more terrible, the better. But, Tilly, we need to get our audience involved.
So, listeners, we want to hear your nightmare podcasting experiences. Did you ever have a guest who kept interrupting you? Or maybe your co-host accidentally revealed their most embarrassing secret on air? We want you to share your cringiest stories
really
with
embarrassing. Yeah, absolutely, Tilly. We're all about celebrating the absolute chaos of podcasting. Together, we can make the world a more hilariously disastrous place.
And if you're feeling brave enough to share your terrible podcasting skills with the world, we'd love to have you on as a guest. The more unqualified, the better.
Absolutely. But before we move on, I want to give a shout out to our totally made up, 100% fake sponsor, Podblender. Sick of boring, polished podcasts? Let Podblender help you make a mess of it all.
That's right, Chris. With Podblender's cutting-edge technology, you can add all the awkward pauses, stutters, and burps you want. They're the only editing software that makes your podcast sound like it was recorded by a bunch of amateurs in their basement.
That's the way I love my podcast. So if you're ready to embrace the chaos and make your podcast the most hilariously terrible thing out there, other than following our advice, head over to Podblender and start blundering right away.
That's it for now. Join us every week for new episodes of Absolutely Don't Do This, the worst podcast ever, and how to avoid making yours it.
Yeah, it's like a box of chocolates, but instead of delicious treats, it's terrible podcast content.
Okay, but wait, podcasters, there's a better way to do podcasting, and that's where Starseed comes in. Don't be that podcast. Starseed is all you need.
That's right, guys. We might be the worst intentionally right now, but we don't want you to be. With Starseed Productions, you have everything you need to create a podcast that doesn't make your listeners want to run for the hills.
But hey, if you want to create a podcast that's intentionally bad, we won't judge you. In fact, we'll probably be your biggest fans, because let's face it, there's nothing quite like a train wreck to keep you entertained.
Yeah, except maybe the one in Ohio.